Hi, my name is Spencer, and I'm a video editor living in England. As you might tell from my voice, I'm not originally from there. I grew up in California, and I miss my family very much. So much, in fact, that I regularly stay up very late on Friday nights so that I can see them through video calls. And to keep myself occupied while waiting for the calls to begin, I decided to start live streaming some acoustic virtual concerts a little while back. Music, however, is something that I am relatively unskilled at, so I decided to put my video editing skills to use and at the very least make my live streams a little nicer in one way or another. At the very least, I can treat it as practice and a portfolio piece to get back at the people who keep refusing to give me entry-level positions. Like, seriously, are you kidding me? I have a degree in this. You don't think I'm qualified for an internship? So here's the mission statement. Improve my music live streams and build my portfolio by coming up with an aesthetic and building motion graphics to support it. Let's go. I had done live stream assets before when I was just starting out, both for clients and for myself before I went to university. But a lot of them were just kind of wonky and felt more like I was bumbling my way through After Effects as opposed to making and maintaining an aesthetic. There were a lot of weird technical decisions I made which I felt I could be able to work around now that I knew more about the technical side of broadcasting and video data. You know, like how alpha channels work. You don't need to add a keyable background to everything, kid. The first thing I wanted to do was come up with an advertisement for it to post to social media. I'd recently gained a whole 40 followers on Twitter for some fan art I made about a niche book series, Warrior Cats.
There will be three with the power of the stars.
Presumably, they constituted a good target audience for this kind of thing, so I got to work tailoring a graphic to those interests. I had decided to make it look like a floating patch of grass with my guitar floating above it, with a little kitty cat sleeping on top of the guitar. So I got to work modeling and animating the patch of land in Blender. I figured a cutesy cartoony aesthetic would work best for this kind of advertisement because if it was sufficiently stylized, that meant I could reuse it or certain parts of it without fear of it looking anachronistic in any way in the future. After the grass was done, I added a few clouds I had made for another project before I realized that I wasn't happy with the look of the grass. The texture associated with the grass was a map I had pulled from a tutorial I followed a month or so back when I started learning how to do 3D stuff in the first place. So I decided to go pull another one from Google Image Search that better represented the color scheme I wanted. Then, using Glimpse, an open source image editor, I made adjustments until content and refit the grass into the scene. After that was done, I added in a guitar model and gave it some materials. Fortunately, a few weeks back I had made some similar materials for another project of mine, which meant I could just drag and drop the old ones in and do some tweaking to ensure it looked more true to the actual instrument. Part of this meant darkening the texture in places to match my guitar's sensual mahogany color, removing the glossy shader, and changing up pieces of the model or adding in additional image texture into a MixRGB node to give the guitar a sunburst look. Now it was time to populate the scene. I added a few lights to give it a warmer look as I didn't like the way that the blue from the grass and sky were reflecting onto the guitar's surface. I also added in rocks, which I could texture using a shader I made following a tutorial a few weeks back, and flowers, which I could color with a simple emission shader. Once the guitar render was done, I could add in the cat. I had a pretty good idea about what I wanted to accomplish with it. I had previously done art studies on idle animations in fighting games, and there is just a certain je ne sais quoi about it that really works for me. I Frankensteined together some reference images in Eclipse Studio Paints and made a base sketch of what I wanted to draw. Then I went back to the guitar render to tweak and re-export it a few times for the sake of getting the guitar and the cat to be in the main focal point of the image. Once that was done, I made a less sketchy proto-line art and then 4 actual line arts based on the initial line art. I knew I couldn't do the line art entirely based on the sketch because if I wanted the model to look relatively calm, I'd need the animation to be subtle. Once I had all 4 different versions of my line art, I did some basic coloring and exported all 4 different versions of the cat as a PNG. Once that was done, I brought it into After Effects and composited it all together, animating the PNG and syncing it up to the guitar's bobbing. I also added a background and some visual onomatopoeias just to make it clear that there wasn't a dead cat on top of a floating guitar. Then I tracked an image of my guitar's logo to the top of the headstock because I forgot to do it in Blender. Whoops. Once I had it all assembled, I got to work with the color correction. In my opinion, a big part of what makes multimedia art work is if it genuinely feels like it all belongs together. Anyone looking at this can tell that the cat is 2D, whereas the floating island and the guitar are 3D. What helps keep it together, though, is a consistent color scheme tying the entire piece, together. It might also help that the clouds and background appear to be 2D as well, even if they are arranged in 3D space. By the next day, I had decided on an aesthetic for the live stream, so it was time to get to work on that. In a previous stream, one of my friends commented that it felt a little bit like a campfire, so I figured I could run with that feeling. In Adobe Photoshop, I made a quick starry image texture, which I then animated with noise and blending modes in After Effects, and forgot to record basically half of the process for this video. Sorry. What you won't miss is the process of me making an image mask for the stars to sit atop in the live stream. Now that it was time for me to design the actual stream, I grabbed an unattractive yet typical looking reference image from my prior stream and began drawing on top of that in Clip Studio Paint. I decided I wanted the layout to have a swath of stars at the top to act as a background where I could display text. I then did some rudimentary mock-ups of the other campfire-esque aspects I wanted to mimic, a collection of bracken and dead leaves off to the side, a roaring fire off to the other. Using the sketch as a base, I took it into Blender and got to work. After importing some nature assets I had lying around, I got to work arranging them in front of the camera in such a way that matched my mock-up. Then I added in a spotlight, which I animated to change between certain fiery colors so as to give it the appearance of actually being next to an open fire. However, I was dissatisfied as the arrangement I used resulted in very few shadows and ambience being cast against the other objects, and I felt the lighting was uninteresting. I decided to resolve this by making the objects physically closer together with the particle system, creating more of them. I added a small area beneath the objects for them to drop onto, and then I created that particle system so I could generate a large amount of objects to fill the space. After fiddling with the object density and topography to get an appropriate looking shape to the pile of leaves and rocks and weeds, I moved on to adding a cluster of ivy off to the side because I felt there wasn't enough usage of the space on that side of the screen. I hadn't ever made ivy before, but I guessed at the process and I believe I came off relatively successfully. I generated a path using a noise generation tool, turned it into a mesh, attached a particle system to it, and then set the particle to be a plane with an ivy leaf texture I found on the internet. However, in the process of doing this, I received a message. I had never before felt so threatened. Time was beginning to run low, and I hadn't even started on the fire. I finished up the ivy in a hurry, adding in a tree trunk at the very end just to make it look as though the ivy was hanging onto something, and moved on. Fire and volumetric simulations have always been my enemy in Blender, and I've almost never gotten them to work at all, let alone work well. No matter how much documentation I read up on or watch, I've never been able to get a smoke simulation to work how I want, which ended up putting another one of my projects, an attempt to recreate Schlieren visualization with VFX programs, in a coma. But surely if it's something as simple as lighting a regular little fire and keeping that working for 400 or so frames, I should be fine, right?
Wrong!
This is the closest that this project has ever gotten to being stressful for me. I knew after a few hours of trying to get it to work that I could just use someone else's fire asset from Action Essentials or something to save myself a lot of time and brain power, but it's really important to me that I learn how to do this. Maybe someday in the future I'll be able to save myself time and brain power by just making a fire sim real quick instead of having to worry about usage rights to stock VFX assets. After grinding away at the fire for a little while longer, I noticed that the quality of light had started to change. It was the evening golden hour. Thursday was almost over. I decided to take a break and record a quick video that I wanted to use on the stream, and then I tested a few assets to make sure I wouldn't have issues with synchronicity in OBS. Then, back to the fire. I'm not kidding, doing the fire took more time than basically the entire rest of the project combined. I even gave up doing it in Blender at one point and tried it out in Houdini, but I couldn't figure out how to get the camera to move, so I went back to the program I knew better. In the end, eventually, somehow, after flitting between multiple versions of Blender and an experimental branch or two trying to figure out how to get the damn transparency to work fine before realizing that if I render it with transparency it'd take too long because there's a bug involving NVIDIA graphics cards and volumetrics and X version of Blender and all kinds of ridiculous and very stupid issues, I got it to work to a somewhat satisfying extent. Exasperated, I let it render out overnight and went to bed. The next day, I got to work compositing. After dropping my renders into the timeline and fiddling with blending modes for a few minutes, I realized I would end up having to key most of it because the fire wasn't transparent, and also I forgot that image masks were a thing and I didn't have to use chroma key for the stars. Once it was all assembled, I got to work figuring out how to bring it into OBS. From here, I figured out some issues with the current arrangement and decided I would be better off moving the fire into its own timeline and exporting it separately so I could refine the key on the stars and ensure that the pile of leaves wouldn't have annoying keying artifacts behind it. I then keyed the stars to fit into the timeline, found a blending mode I liked, and began adding a gradient and vignette to the scene. The idea of the vignette was to affect the look of the fire, so I set it up so a corner of it was constantly changing color and flickering. Now, when it was overlaid atop my webcam, it would look like I was next to a fire. Certified genius, I know. I also added in a snowfall effect for the sake of creating rising embers from the fire. I had to be careful about these and make sure they were subtle so they wouldn't mess up the stream's bitrate, but they'd still add visual interest to the scene. Once that was done, I touched up the fire to give it transparency and opened up DaVinci Resolve. Like I said before, I think one of the most important parts of working with an aesthetic is ensuring cohesion, so I wanted to be sure that each asset used would look less like an asset I was using and more like a piece of a unit. So once again, color grading. First, I color graded the screenshot from my own camera to be something a little more neutral and a little less straight out of an episode of The Simpsons. Then I exported that grade as a LUT, or lookup table, so I could apply it to my OBS webcam and make sure that my video and streams from that point onward wouldn't be so objectively bad. After doing that, I began grading the assembled version of the overlay, using stills from films and TV shows that I felt had a Campfire-like feel to them. My best friend for this process was the Lab C color space, which makes darks bluer and whites more orangey. It has a strong indie look. Once I got the grading to my satisfaction, I exported the LUT and opened up OBS, ready to bring in my assets and apply them in there. Except, this happened. This was new to me. I was so confident that having a video with an alpha channel would work that I had no idea what my recourse was going to be if it didn't. I did some research and tried to apply some fixes, such as using .apngs or other video codecs, or making sure that the alpha channel was unmatted instead of pre-multiplied, but I just couldn't figure it out. Fortunately, at that point, I remembered what an image mask was, and after tweaking some exports, I did eventually get it to work just as expected. After throwing the fire in, it was ready to stream.
Nebulousness less, consciousness is free. Meanings meaningless, faced with open heavens and the open sea. And that's for those who craft and mine in our reality. So yeah, that's nebulousness.
And what a stream it was, honestly. I got a chance to try some things and play some songs I didn't try before, and I had a chill, relaxing time by the campfire, just as I had hoped. Some things worked, some things didn't, and a good time was had by all. And in the end, I even figured out how to use my OBS to broadcast to my family video call, which was an unexpected pleasure. Before I close, some final thoughts. If I were to do anything differently, it absolutely would have been the fire. I decided very early on in this project that I was aiming more on the side of photorealism because most of my Blender practice tends to be non-photorealistic and I wanted to practice that more. However, this boxed me in pretty heavily with the fire because it forced me into an area I have very little experience with and resulted in long rendering times that took large chunks out of the day. With non-photorealistic fire, it's generally controlled by noise, textures, and volumetrics don't factor in, which would have been easier to do. However, by the time I had started on the fire, I had already done the foliage, so I didn't want to mix up the art style by changing it. Overall, it would have been smarter to me to just use someone else's fire simulation or practice more in Houdini so I could do it in there. In the end though, I think I did a pretty decent job with the resources and experiences at my disposal. It's not the most perfect livestream overlay, but it's serviceable, unobtrusive, and clearly presents an aesthetic that the content can lean on. And when you look at the checklist of stuff I had to prepare for this, I can't help but feel a little bit proud. That's nothing to sneeze at. I think it's pretty good for a guy who isn't experienced enough to get an internship. That's a nice scarf. Where'd you get it? Did you get it from Primark?
Yeah, it's
maybe?
from Primark.
From Primark?
Do you want this or not? Because
Look,
you have to stop asking people if their clothing is from Primark. You know they don't like it. You know
I think it's an acceptable topic of conversation. I think it's very important within. I didn't ask about the jacket. I just wanted to know.